but also I feel like that's a good thing. I should have go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin with an introduction by Professor Schwarz.
Okay, so this is an honor and a joy. The origins of my fortunate acquaintance with our speaker's work came from my wife being so absorbed in a book that she wouldn't communicate with anyone. So Administrator Power, as they call her, would respond when one of our children or I said anything, go away. But she was happy when she said it. She wasn't impatient. It was like, go away, I'm transported. And then I finally got her attention, and she said she was reading a book by Géraldine Schwarz called Those Who Forget, and then she just had no words. She said, God. And then she said, you must read it too. And the word must had a kind of firmness and direction that sounded like the law was being laid down. And I thought a book about memory and horror, that's not like what I need right now. But the direction was clear. And starting the book, I too was transported and entranced and thought, gosh. So the book is a transcendent achievement, and I'll say a little bit about why. Our speaker, Géraldine Schwarz, is a journalist, an author, and a documentary filmmaker. The book that you're about to hear a discussion of has won, I believe, 12 awards, and that's about a fifth as many as it deserves. And I believe in the fullness of time, it will receive the acclaim that it's already well on the road to getting. Schwarz studied history at the Sorbonne and at the London School of Economics. As the book extremely powerfully specifies, she is both French and German. She joined in 1997 the Paris Journal School Centre de Formation des Journalistes de Paris, and I am showing off my French accent here, and then worked at Bloomberg News and became a correspondent for Agence France Presse in Berlin. She's now, as noted, working in Berlin and making films as well as writing. Two thoughts about what you're about to hear. You're about to hear from people who will have much more clarity than I. The first is the author's statement, which is, the most dangerous monster is not a megalomaniacal and violent leader, but us, the people who make him possible, who give him the power to lead. That kind of cries out in detail from the book. And the second thought is, I found one of the most powerful moments in the book. Charles de Gaulle, who's described in the book as giving a rosy and inaccurate conception of how the French people responded to the occupation under him. That de Gaulle's account was not truthful. And de Gaulle said at one point, in response to the mounting clarity about what actually happened, what the French people need is not truth but hope, which is an extremely powerful account of one understanding of how to deal with history. The book, which is about memory and horror and memory work, achieves something which is, I think, not achievable really, which is to leave the reader with a sense of inspiration and something, I'm groping for words, something elevating, as well as deeply, moving about what human beings can do to one another. And my thought last night was, how did she do that? And I think the way she did that is she answered the call. What people need is truth and hope. We're very fortunate to have her here.
So we'll do a 10 minutes to 15 minutes presentation from Geraldine, and then we'll open up the space for conversations. I have a lot more questions than what's, it will take us an hour and a half or more to go through. But we'll open it up so that I'll have an opportunity to ask her some questions, but then you will as well. But if you don't, I have more questions to ask. So let's open it up, and please welcome.
I thought you were going to ask me the questions, but so I haven't actually a presentation ready. I'm sorry. Maybe just starting with why I decided to write this book. So first, actually, I wanted to write a political book and not a personal book. This is a personal story, it's my family story. But in 2017, I thought I would like to make a contribution to memory work in Europe. The European Union was founded on memory of wars, of the Holocaust, and of totalitarianism. It's the big main difference with the United States. The dream of Europe is to share the same history, and the dream of the United States, I believe, is to erase the past of each other so everybody can share a similar future. But for Europe, this idea of sharing the same history is, laid the foundations of the European Union. And because of the growing threat of populist parties in Europe, especially in France nowadays, but back then also in Germany in 2017, for the first time, a far-right nationalist party entered the parliament, the Bundestag. This was the first time since the end of World War II. And I thought, what is, are we about to forget? Are we about to forget about this past, which lays the foundation of the world we're living in? So I decided to write a contribution to this memory work. But of course, if you write a book about memory work and you're about to criticize countries which haven't done this work, you have to do your own work yourself, the work of your own family story. So I started to question two witnesses of my grandparents, which are my aunt and my father. My father was German, and he was born in 1943, and he's part of a generation who, after the war, beginning in the late 50s and 60s, started to question their own parents about what they did during the war. So my father was very happy to collaborate with me by writing this book. And he told me a few things about his own father, that his own father was a member of the Nazi Party in the 30s, but that he wasn't a convinced Nazi. He was more a Nazi out of opportunism. But what he didn't tell me, and what I discovered myself by searching into the cellar of our family house in southwest Germany, is that in 1938 my grandfather bought a company from a Jewish family. That means that he took advantage of anti-Semitic Nazi policy to make, to buy a business for a very low price. This is actually, the company was a small company. This kind of attitude was quite ordinary at that time in the 30s in Germany. So I thought this is like a banal story. Which reader will be interested in such an ordinary story? Because most of the Germans, supported the Nazi regime or took advantage from it. But it is precisely because it is a very banal attitude that I thought it might interest the readers. Because it shows the attitude of most of the Germans under the Third Reich. Most of the Germans were not perpetrators, they were not victims and not heroes. They were what I call midlifer, so those who follow the current. There is no word for that in English, which I find interesting because that means maybe that there wasn't a reflection in American society about this phenomenon of being responsible for consolidating a criminal state just by following the current. There are only, as far as now, I've only found 2 countries who have a similar term. It's Sweden and the Netherlands. But France also doesn't have a term like that. And in our collective memory of war and dictatorships in Europe, we tend to divide the attitude of society into 3 categories, which is perpetrator, heroes, or victims. And we forget about this category of midlifer, which is actually very important because it's one of the major actors. And I think maybe the reason why is because it's not a spectacular attitude. And also in fiction also contributed very much to this obliviousness of midlifer, because it's difficult, to write a novel or to make a film about this figure, which is in a gray zone. It's indefinite. However, I think that it is difficult to learn from history without acknowledging this actor, because you cannot really identify with perpetrators, with monsters, as a citizen. You cannot imagine being Dr. Mengele or throwing babies against the wall to kill them, like some Nazis did in extermination camps. But you can imagine being my grandfather. You can imagine that out of opportunism, you might become accomplice of a criminal regime. Especially if you can buy, a company for a cheap price, or a nice flat for a cheap price. And so the reflection about this figure of the midlifer is very central in order to learn from history. It sends us back, I think, to our own responsibilities and contradictions today. So it is a family book, but the family is an alibi to talk about this figure of midlifer too.
Let me take the baton from there.
Okay.
And that's really what I liked. First, I have to say, thank you for writing this book, and congratulations for being able to pull off something that I thought was interesting. And it is that you not only transported and transfixed, I'll say, me as a reader, but what I found was that it was a personal account. It was, by all accounts, when you think about history, you're thinking about the big picture, what happened, the numbers, the economy. But this was a personal story of one person, of one family. And that story is told very well. And it's not the story of history. It's not, heroes or villains. It's not big characters. It's just one regular family. But in telling that story, you're also able to tell not just the history of Germany from the First World War, and especially the Second World War, but you're able to tell these universal human phenomena. And that is really where I was able to relate to the book. Although I grew up in Ethiopia, in Eastern Africa, Ethiopia and part in Somalia, 70 years after the events you described, and I could still relate to what you're writing. And what you're writing, the conclusions, the lessons are still relevant. That is really what I found the book, what I found fascinating about the book. My first question relates to memory, and memory in the sense of also something that, one of the things that I really related to, one of the stories I related to is in the 9th chapter, where you describe in a very warm, vivid detail the ornate furniture in your grandparents' house. You say, furniture that's reeking of grand bourgeoisie. And that personal space that you grew up in, you later found out is property and furniture that was bought at auctions of individuals that were either fleeing or that would later perish. And in that description, you also tell how the fleeing victims in this context were sometimes in the same room where their objects, personal objects, were being sold off in auction. So that there's something very personal about it. But then, how does one justify to themselves? Because this experience that I read, if you've ever been to the house of a deceased family member, you have this feeling where there's like this heavy presence. That's what I felt reading through that chapter. And my first question is, how does one function as a midwifer? How does one forget in that moment, in that personal moment, forget that what they're doing is wrong?
Thank you very much. Well, first is the midlifer figure, I have to add, is not a German figure. It's not only existing under the Third Reich, it's universal and timeless. So this is why I'm happy you could relate to it. But the chapter you mentioned, I don't know if you've read this chapter, but maybe I just can describe a little bit. My father discovered in the 60s by watching pictures of his parents' flat from before the war, that the furniture was different before the war and after the war, and during the war. And so we don't have a confirmation, but he suspects his parents to have bought this furniture during auction, auction which were selling Jewish goods during the war. And I found out later that many auctions took place in the flats left by the Jews when they were deported, so that the people who went to this auction knew who these belongings who were the propriétaires, who were the owners of these belongings. Many times it was in the same district. So it might have been people they had known themselves, maybe the pharmacist or the doctor of next door, or the neighbors, maybe former friends. And that really shocked me, because I thought many midwifer in Germany were midwifer out of blindness. And sometimes it's easy, if you don't want to understand what's going on, if you want to blind yourself, it's not that difficult. But when you go in the flat of a neighbor who you had known, who was deported, and you buy his belongings, you cannot pretend to be blind anymore. And also, it makes one excuse of the Germans after the war totally invalid, and this excuse was that they didn't know. Of course, most of the Germans didn't know that the Jews were deported in extermination camps and that were gassed. But if you buy belongings from Jews in a flat that they have just left, that means that you don't expect them to return. So I thought this is a very important point. So the forgetting about, in that moment, forgetting that you are contributing to a criminal state, I think this is very easy. Because if you take advantage, first you take advantage of the despair of a community. So the advantage, the Third Reich was very clever in understanding that you cannot convince the people just by ideology or by anti-Semitic ideology. You have to offer something more. And what they offered was you can take advantage from the despair of this community. So that many Germans took advantage, even in universities. University professors could have refused to take the job of a Jewish colleague who got fired. But most of them didn't refuse. They took the job. It was an opportunity for their career. And you had these kind of examples in many, many, many different fields. And this is how the Third Reich convinced also many Germans to become anti-Semitic. But after the war, how you forget about your responsibility as a midlifer after the war, this is what happened to my grandfather, because the second part of the story tells how I find a letter from my grandfather who writes to the only survivor of this Jewish company, this company he built from a Jewish family, who demanded reparations after the war. And my grandfather responded, he refused to pay reparations, and he left copies of his own letters, and in this letter you can see that he's in total denial of his responsibility as a midlifer during the Third Reich. And most of German society after the war was in total denial of their responsibility, to a point that they considered themselves as victims.
Okay, so let me take you from the past to the present. And what are the lessons that we could take for the present, and especially in the context where war has come back to Europe? Is that because we have not learned our lesson, and therefore, doomed to repeat history, or am I reading this wrong? And we did learn from the lesson. This is just an aberration.
Well, so obviously barbarism is back to Europe. And one of the reasons, in my opinion, of that is that a political leader, Vladimir Putin, is unable to come to terms with the past. He sees himself invested with a mission, the mission to rehabilitate the glory of the Russian history. He feels that Russia was humiliated by Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. So he rewrites history, he polishes it, he erases the shadows, and he tries, to give an only positive image of his country. And by doing this, he doesn't only try to glorify nation identity, but he also uses history as a weapon of mass destruction. So he uses history to justify imperialistic violence. I mean, nowadays in Russia, history is distorted everywhere. At schools, in the museums, in the media, in fiction, in the films. And there is even a law that stipulates that the state guarantees the protection of historical truth. But on the other side, what is interesting is the reaction of the Europeans, because actually the war unified the Europeans. Europeans are always divided, they always fight, they never, it's very hard for Europeans to take decisions because of these divisions. But on that point precisely, the Europeans were very unified. And this is the positive message of this war, that maybe the Europeans did learn something from history. So that they don't allow themselves to be divided anymore. And people have, now the taste of liberty, of freedom, of peace. And maybe now they know that no ideology, no imperialism is worth sacrificing peace and freedom, and that no history is worth dying for.
Okay, so stretching from what's happening with history telling in Russia to what you described in Germany, what are the lessons that are in the middle? History, coming to terms with history done wrong is an example with what's happening in Russia. What are the other alternatives that are in the middle, that are not necessarily leading to war, but leading to not preventing the fetishization of history or the grandeur of history?
You mean the Germans fetishize history?
No, I'm making reference to the rise in, for example, far-right thinking all over Europe. And we can also bring this conversation to the US, but let's, first visit Europe. So in terms of learning from history, what are the different lessons you could draw out in that spectrum?
Well, first, there is a difference between Germany and other states. For obvious reasons, Germany really made this effort to come to terms with the past. I would say one key of the success of memory work in Germany is that the Germans did put the midlifer figure in the center of their remembrance culture. This was possible because the claim to do this memory work came from society. It was not imposed from on high. And second, the question which rose was more, how could this happen than what did happen? And this is a big difference. So German society, it took a long time after scandalous impunity, but beginning in the late 60s, society started to question itself, the whole society. Not the generation of my grandparents. You don't do memory work. The memory work was not for the generation of my grandparents, but for the young generation. And so this young generation, the whole society, started to question itself. And the main question was, how do you become an accomplice of a criminal ideology, of a criminal regime? Out of opportunism, like my grandfather, out of blindness, like my grandmother. She was also a Nazi, but she admired Hitler. She was an admirer of Hitler. She was totally blind She didn't have any political education, I must add. Out of cowardice, out of conformism, most of the time, I also read this in your article, you meant, what is the terminology you use when you conform to the social norms, even if you think differently. This is very powerful, conformism. In German society, at some point, moral got inverted. So what was evil yesterday started to be good, and what was good started to be evil. And this is, I think, the main thing you can learn from reflecting about this history is to know yourself better, to know that you can fail. That sounds a bit negative, but it's indispensable to be in a democracy as a citizen who has actually the power to change something through his vote. You have to be aware that you can fail. And reflecting about this history to the point of view of the midlifer allows you to reflect about your own failure. And I think this is very powerful in Germany until now. I don't know, Germany is not immune, but until now, the far-right party is, limited. It has more or less 10% of the votes. It had 10% of the votes at the last election. It's much less than in many other countries in Europe, especially in France, where at the last election, the far-right party got more than 40% of the votes. In Italy, we can call it the neo-fascist party, is ruling the country right now. In Spain, the far-right party is also very powerful. And these are all countries who either have dealt with their past, like Italy and Spain, or in France it's a bit different. The memory work has been done, but the midlifer is not at the center. The tendency in France would be to blame the leaders. So the French are ashamed of having this history of collaborating with the Third Reich, but they're blaming the leaders. And there is nothing like a reflection on the attitude of French society under collaboration. And so many countries have missed the opportunity to strengthen their democracy or the awareness for democratic responsibility among their citizens by doing this memory work.
Okay, let me also open it up to the audience, but I have one more question maybe that I'll pose and then open it up. So one of the things that I felt reading through this book was I was also seeing what my role is, since Ethiopia is going through a similar unraveling currently. It forced me to ask what I've done, what I could have done, and what kinds of similarities there are that I could learn from this book. And I'm wondering, let me ask the question as, I'm wondering how some of the descriptions you have of the Nazi regime testing the people out with different, provocations, small things, whether the publics in the U.S. especially, how they have reacted to, children in cages and things like that. But before coming to you, let me open it up to the audience and
I just had a question around this idea of memory work and maybe just challenging the notion of Germany having done that work, because it sounds like you're referring to West Germany, and we're in Ostdeutschland, where that is where I think the AfD is really consolidating its power. And I've spent a lot of time in Brandenburg and in the former GDR and talked to a lot of I guess residents there, but I don't know where I'm trying to locate my question. It's just how do you think that kind of complicates this idea of like the memory work having been done? I think the same in Italy and in Spain. It's usually kind of regions that feel more economically disenfranchised, right? So there's kind of more to the picture, and then I think does that make any sense? I think maybe if you could just speak to the East and West in Germany kind of picture, and then how state formation might have, like, post-DDR, like how memory work has been kind of done in those regions, and maybe why the right has kind of come to power in those regions. And I think I would disagree in terms of they actually do have a lot of agency within, for the Northeast and within Eastern Germany. That was a bit of a muddle. It wasn't really a question. I'm just trying to form a question. But yeah.
Oh, there are many questions there. Maybe let's focus on West and East Germany. That's very interesting because you're right. When I say Germany, actually I think West Germany. West Germany built its democracy on memory work. You cannot divide those. And in East Germany, there was also memory work. I mean, East Germany was founded on the myth that it was the country of the communist Germans who had fought the Nazis on the side of the Soviet Union. And that was maybe true for the leaders. The leaders had been communists on the Third Reich. Many were sent in concentration camps, but the people were the same than in the West. I mean, there was nothing like West and East. They were midlifer. So the regime had to infiltrate society with anti-fascism, in an artificial way. So there were many commemorations, starting at school. Little children would start, the school day with an anti-fascist commemoration. But the difference, the key difference, is that the East Germans identified themselves with the victims, or the heroes, with the communists, and not with the perpetrators, not with the midlifer. So in the West, starting in the 60s, 70s, society really identified, accepted that they had played a role in the Nazi crimes. So this is one of the reasons, but not only. But for me, it is one of the reasons why democracy is not that well anchored in the East. It is also a much younger democracy. When did the wall fall? 30 years ago. 30 years ago. But of course, because there hasn't been this reflection on midlifertum, on responsibility, I think the awareness of your duties in a democracy is less spread in the East. But when I'm talking about the East, it's really the region, the East, because many Germans coming from the East, young German coming from the East, living in the West, they are educated like the West Germans. And there is an intergenerational rupture there between the younger East Germans. When they come back to their homes in East Germany, they don't get on with their parents anymore, who had been educated under a dictatorship. And 1/3 of the people vote for the far-right party, AfD. And it's a very difficult, it's really challenging for Germany, because Germany in the West has a similar interpretation of the past, and it allows them to have this what we name a collective memory. But this collective memory is not really shared by part of the Eastern Germans. This problem is even worse in Spain. There is nothing like a collective memory in Spain because the population is really very strongly divided. After Franco's death in the 70s, the parliament passed a law which was a kind of law of forgetting, Even the Social Democrats passed this law, voted for this law, because they thought to build the country, to build a new country, a democracy, we need a unified society, and we cannot have a unified society based on the divisions of the past. And this was maybe back at that time the better answer, but now 50 years later, you know, in Spain, no memory work has been done, and society is more divided than ever. The case of Italy is the most surprising one, because Italy is the country where fascism was born. And it was the first ally of Germany, you know, ideologically and on a military level. And I don't know if you know the older Primo Levi, survivor of Auschwitz, who said in an interview in the late 70s that Italy is hiding behind the atrocities of the Nazis. And so in Europe, because the atrocities of the Nazis were unbeatable, and because the Germans started to do this memory work, many other countries, you know, tried to hide behind these atrocities to avoid to make their own memory work. And this is what happened with Italy.
Yeah, let's take 3 questions and then.
One, just a very quick point. In midlife, we might say go with the flow.
Yes.
I agree with you that the masses have to look to what their responsibility. This is very good. I caution you, though, at the beginning you talked about the banality of it. I think we have Hannah Annette to blame for that, and as the recent IQ tapes have shown, it was not simple, I'll go with whatever orders I have. It was deep-rooted belief in what they were saying, and I think many of these midlifers over centuries have been conditioned to believe what Hitler was producing for them. And further evidence, you talked about your grandfather not wanting to make reparations for the small business. Countries have passed laws, and this is good to say in the law school, that you can effectively buy something that has a defective title, and then you have it. And so they have refused, even the museums have refused the restorations. So I think a lot of work still has to be done. And with respect to Italy, the newly released Vatican archives might be very interesting to put into your considerations.
Let's take it in that.
How do you reconcile the difficult question of accountability versus reconciliation? And oftentimes, you know, if you're failing to hold somebody accountable for the sake of reconciliation, you might be losing one or the other. And how do you think there are different times for these things? How do you think they interact? And when is there a certain way to tell when one's appropriate versus the other, and when you sort of need to just hold somebody accountable, even if you're continuing to have like inner societal tensions in a way that can be resolved?
Thank you for your remarks and your writing. I wondered how you felt you could define, if you could define, the differences between the midloafer and this historical experience of Nazism in comparison, say, with 2 countries roundly described as democratic. The first is the United States. So we talk a lot about the Trump election. We had millions of people who could come very close to fitting into the midloafer. I remember interviews that were television by the barrel of elderly and not very knowledgeable ladies, particularly in the period where they were not very well educated, believing completely in the big lie and hence enthusiastically supporting Trump. Were they simply going along with the majority of their communities? Were they quiet accomplices, which maybe is some bad English equivalent of midloafer? Because they were certainly vital to Trump's success. and maybe future success, just as much as the middling German who did not protest and thought Germany will become great again was responsible for, as you say, Hitler's. So I wonder how, though you compare the high percentage of Trump supporters who simply believe one or another version of the big lie and make possible through the vote the democratic key instrument of showing we're a democracy. And even in Israel, the present threats to the Constitution, the people who are supporting the coalition, the reigning right-wing coalition, Israel has done very well economically and technically. Is this a feeling of, hey, this has to be a good government, and hence there can't be anything wrong with amending our non-constitution in certain ways? What are the differences or similarities between these kinds of support for what are, just one quick thing, when I was a student at the college or at the law school years and years and years and years ago, I could go on with years, none of what roils America today, none of the contentious disputes that lead to efforts to block certain kinds of education or certain kinds of reading were about because there was nothing to block. I don't think 3 syllables, a slight exaggeration, were pronounced about the matters which so perplex us today. I knew so little about slavery, for example. I knew so little about the profound, rooted, deeply embedded inequalities in American life, which made most of the country blind to me being educated at an elite university. Is that at all similar? Burying the past or reifying certain elements of the past to permit a present to ignore that and hence march ahead as if it's all on the achievement side. So those are my questions.
Any questions?
You do this.
Let me go, and then I have a question for you.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm not sure I remember everything, but the first comment about banality. I mean, you cannot compare Eichmann and my grandfather, you know.
I wasn't doing that.
So I totally agree that Eichmann was not banal, and he was very much convinced, and many of the key perpetrators were convinced. But in the case of my grandfather, I think it was ordinary in the sense that it's the way many Germans thought at that time, you know. And I think maybe an important point is that in his letters after the war, my grandfather defends himself by saying that it was legal, being in the law school, and that he acted legally. So it is true that one good, trick of the Nazis was to legalize crime. And because the Germans were historically very attached to laws, for them maybe what was important was that they had the feeling that the state of law was still existing. And this is what, the Nuremberg laws in 1935. Why would a criminal regime make this effort to make laws to justify the crimes? Because, in a way, it helped people to become accomplices, having the feeling that they were doing it within a legal framework. Your question about reconciliation and accountability, well, that's a good question. I have never really thought of making a difference between both of them, but of course, for me, accountability comes first. I think you cannot, make this work in a culture of guilt. Not anymore. Of course, my father, he felt guilty, and his generation when they started to make this memory work. But now my generation, the next generation, or even in the United States, I think regarding now the slavery part, This work should not be done in a culture of guilt. It should not be instrumentalized to stir up revanchism, to stir up sectarianism. It should not threaten freedom of speech. But still, on the state level, I think the first step is to apologize. So taking accountability would be to apologize, because the state is, it's the continuation of the former criminal state. So this is very important to give an example, so that society might then make the effort of reflecting about the crimes of the past. To take the perspective of the victim. But then it is important also to overcome the dialectic victim versus perpetrator, which was easier in Germany than nowadays in the United States, because many victims were dead and gone, So the dialectic victim's perpetrator is a kind of deadlock. The reconciliation step, I think, implies also a part of forgetting. Not only forgiving, but forgetting. So forgetting and remembering goes hand in hand. I can take as an example the French-German reconciliation. So first there was the apology from Germany, and then the reconciliation, which was partly based on forgetting. Winston Churchill in 1946, asked the Europeans to forget. He thought that, his plea would help preserve peace. But the French-German reconciliation was more based on remembering than on forgetting. Remembering together. And this is what's all about. Memory work should be a process which allows an intercultural dialogue, and not, of course, confronting each other. I don't know if I answered your question, but this still, if there is no culture of guilt, there should be a culture of responsibility. Or for a young generation who cannot be held guilty for what happened 100 or 200 years ago, they still have a responsibility. They still have the duty to remember. And this is maybe the difference I make between responsibility and guilty. And just to end, this is a thought I had more recently, that shame is not only negative. Because in France, I would say in the last 10 years, this memory work has faded a little bit. The new generations are not interested anymore in this past distant history. And I think I relate this to the rise of hatred speeches, of far-right parties. And shame protects us from the worst. I think in Germany, the fact that there is still this shame is very healthy. It protects the Germans from the worst. Oh my God, the Israeli, this is a big question. Similarities, and I could write an essay on it.
You should.
Yes. There are so many differences. I mean, the similarity is just that the midlifer is not only American; it's everywhere, and it's not only related to politics. It's also related to the way we consume. When we buy a T-shirt from Vietnam, we can imagine that maybe there's child work involved. It's the same for climate change. How often do we take the plane when we know actually? I mean, we have such a suicidal attitude. So it's really, I think all of us are midlifer. And what is very important to reflect about is that it's better to prevent than to cure in any case. When I think of my grandparents, in the 30s, they were not politically educated. But nowadays, when you live in a democracy and you have access to all kind of information, and you can be educated, even if you don't go to Harvard, you can be educated. And you still believe these lies, you're still very susceptible to all these manipulation techniques. This is something that really frightens me. But here again, I think through memory work, you can really learn to be vigilant. I mean, when memory fades, vigilance fades. And the example of the past, the experience of our ancestors, can make you smarter. And I just believe that most of the people who are who voted for Trump, once I understand that many people are disoriented, so that maybe the future is uncertain. So let's look at the past, because it's the only thing which we have certain is the past, and these are important benchmarks to guide us to shape our present and future.
We have time just for one more.
No, I thought that was fantastic.
Okay. Okay, thank you everyone, thank you.